folks. This is a different sort of project put out there. In this community, we often cite, source, reference the now infamous Anatoly Fomenko book series. After getting hands on a copy, having felt that the conversation surrounding this book was frustratingly devoid of any actual detailed analysis, I felt at the time, as I beheld this book, that I understood the reasons why. And I also understood that all of my searches for something like the series I'm creating right now, which were in vain, which is why I'm doing this now, I understood precisely why. If you ever find yourself listening to a podcast or any content, any format, attempts to break it down for you having read it, and I found this half a dozen times, and as I always do, I take their word for it immediately, and they attempt to tell you that this is an unresearched or unfounded or wildly speculative book, pure fiction, backed with nothing, unfounded, baseless. If you hear any of those terms, I would advise you to ignore that content, to completely reject it out of hand. And I can tell you why. Anyone that would make those statements have never held a copy of this in their hands, or maybe they did and stopped there, never even took a really substantial look at even the first page. And the reason why there's no detailed analysis, and the reason why I would advise you to avoid anyone who says anything along the lines of it's just made up and unresearched, the reason is the same. I can say this without hyperbole. This is the most meticulously and most abundantly sourced writing I have ever encountered. Consider the fact that Anatoly Fomenko is a mathematician and not indeed a historian. That would make a bit of sense, having staunchly been a successful product of the show your own work and cite your sources crowd. I would venture to say there's not a sentence in this book that is stated as fact or stated even as postulated as a theory without having been sourced, cited, and referenced clearly, methodically, and almost irritatingly thorough. So from the very onset, it is abundantly clear that this author has done his research, is a student of research, and that this contains almost no original thought. It contains original question. It doesn't make any definitive statements that I can find blatantly at all. In fact, invites everyone to join the table. This is a massive project pulled from the knowledge base of hundreds of historians and chronologers over the years. And if anything, this acts as a compilation of questions and ideas that have been posed over the years, more than just an act of one man just wildly throwing out ideas, as I've heard podcasts say that this is just the work of a fantasy fiction. And I mean, anyone that's saying anything along those lines has never looked at the book, because you can't be a functionally thinking human being and actually take a shot at reading this book without being immediately overwhelmed by what I've just told you. Which is why I've spent the first few boring minutes of this telling you that. It is very rare someone that has actually made their way through these books. It takes a special kind of maniac, would be what I would describe the reader of this, to sit down and undertake this and actually finish it. And so this is one case, and I don't say this with any hint of arrogance or sense of accomplishment. It's just that people are different. Everyone's mind's different. Everyone's attention level is different. Everyone's available time to spend on these things is different. If you were one of the few where those stars align, where you're a maniac who had to find enough time and interest and effort to do this, I'm one of them. Even though it's a subject matter that I love, I found it to be extremely dense, and I read many chapters repeatedly, that I feel as if I don't want anyone else to have to go through this that can't, or doesn't have time to. I don't want to deprive anyone of the ideas that were put forth here, because I understand that I'm a rare breed. I'm nothing special, no more special than any of you, just rare, as rare as you are, in the way that I watch videos of people who make custom things that are incredible pieces that are just absolutely mind-blowing. In my life, the chances are I will never be able to find the time to dedicate myself to that particular thing. I can admire from afar, and I'm grateful for them to put that out there so I can see how it's done and see how people do it. Would love to be able to dip my hands in all pools, but I don't have enough hands, and there are too many pools. And so I'm grateful when someone puts something out there that can shortcut me to the benefits of having absorbed the information, at least in part, without having to take the time and effort. And all this is a very long-winded effort of saying, I read this book so you don't have to. And I'm doing this so that you may reap the fruits of that, because we're the same thing and we're on the same team, and all ideas are meant to be shared. So I don't want to trigger any copyright. I'm not going to quote from it directly. I'm not going to read it to you as an audiobook. It's sort of a Cliff Notes, if that's not a musty reference. All the important details as I've summed them up to be. It's my take on it. If you want to read this book for yourself, I highly encourage it. If you're the type of person that can handle that. I almost gave up on this multiple times. It's so dense. And I also believe that because it's translated from Russian, there's a sort of a stodgy or stiff element to the language as comes from multilingual translation. While it's very clear to understand, at times it's a bit rigid, which doesn't help it. The only part I'm going to actually read verbatim. I'm going to read just the about the author. I'm no slouch to reading and history. There are hundreds of events and hundreds of people, and assuming the role of paraphraser, it will seem as if I have a masterful knowledge of each and every person and every reference. I don't. If you don't understand some of the references, don't feel like this is above your head. It's above mine too. Also, on the math side, it deserves to be said that the subjects that this gentleman, as a mathematician, received all these accolades for and studied. So I don't presume to understand the complex mathematics, but the subject matter, I don't exactly agree with. So it's not as if this man and I see things eye to eye, which actually makes what he's doing and what he did in this series with history much more compelling to me. And it's amazing to me still. And I say this from a point of view, knowing that I'm sure that in some ways, as we all do, I suffer from the same cognitive dissonance. And there's certain parts of what he does for a career that I feel he is blind to other things that are right there. As I'm sure we all are. We all have our blind spots. And it's just worth noting that this brilliant man has blind spots. This book, I don't think, is one of them. But that's up for you to decide. This is going to be a really neutral take on it, just presenting it in thorough detail. Fomenko, born in 1945, was a full member of the Russian Academy of Sciences. He was a full member of the Russian Academy of Natural Sciences, a full member of the International Higher Education Academy of Sciences. He's a doctor of physics. He's a doctor of mathematics. He's a professor. He was head of the Moscow State University section of the Department of Mathematics and Mechanics. He solved Plateau's problem from the theory of minimal spectral surfaces. He's the author of the theory of invariance and topological classification of integrable Hamiltonian dynamic systems. He's a laureate of the 1996 National Premium of the Russian Federation in Mathematics for a cycle of his works on the rudimentary Hamiltonian dynamical systems and manifold invariance theory. He's an author of 200 scientific publications, 28 monographs and textbooks on mathematics. He's a specialist in geometry, topology. He's calculus of variations, symplectic topology, Hamiltonian geometry and mechanics, computer geometry. He's an author of a number of books on the development of new empirical statistical methods and their application to the analysis of historical chronicles, as well as the chronology of antiquity and the Middle Ages. Now, I'm going to touch on his foreword, his preface, but I'm not going to go through much of it. And so we begin the book with him playing a bit of devil's advocate. He echoes the wonder that maybe one would experience if they are asking themselves why the need to revise this history. Why would anyone want to do this and base this revision on statistical methods? He reminds everyone that from the 16th to 17th century, chronology was actually considered to be under the umbrella of math, before it gradually turned into a field of historical studies which was set aside and only needed some little clarifications over the years, having been completely discovered and learned in full, and the whole chronology intact, without question. And yet, as we often discover, he as well finds that the official version of the chronology is full of contradictions, it's inconsistent, and it deserves what he believes is an attempt at least partially fixing this, based on modern statistics. Is his angle. You see, he's not trying to definitively state this is how it was. He's saying, let's put it through a new standard based on what he knows best, which is statistics. He says he also echoes and understands the question, why is a mathematician even wanting to do this? And the answer to that is his interests are from the point of view of a mathematician, which he believes is distant from historical and chronological issues. But in the 70s, early 70s, he was doing research and dealing with the dates of ancient eclipses, trying to fix a problem in celestial mechanics, of which I'm sure there are plenty. But it had to do with finding this coefficient in this theory of lunar motion and trying to predict the acceleration, and had to do with time. Anything to do with time, obviously you're dealing with history. And he's saying he's going over these computations that were Robert Newton, who was an American astrophysicist of some accomplishment. He finds, which he didn't expect to find, there was this parameter d, whatever that means, behaving weirdly and making a jump from the 8th to 10th century, which couldn't be explained by gravity or the current gravitational theory, and didn't seem to make sense, to the point where Robert Newton, whom he respects, had to invent extra gravitational forces in the Earth-Moon system, which suspiciously, I agree, refuses to, the math didn't work out without these forces, which attracted the interest of the mathematician to go back over this work. What he finds is that Newton's computations were perfect. In his words, they conformed to the highest scientific standards and contained no errors. So this made it even more mysterious. So then he decides, rather logically, that he would check the dates of these ancient eclipses to see if they would affect the result. And he was shocked to find out that he was apparently the first to come to this conclusion, because the scientists that had all dealt with this problem previously, and Newton himself, who was an expert in the field of astronavigation and the theoretical dynamics of these celestial bodies, he found out that they didn't take this route. They had just trusted entirely and completely the ancient historical dates, and so they tried to explain the leap from within their own realm. That is to say, without the idea of questioning ancient chronology. The author finds himself rather lucky in that he had discovered that a man named N.A. Morozov, who was a Russian scientist and actually wrote encyclopedias, he had looked at these ancient eclipse datings before this and claimed many of them need to be revised. And he did this at the beginning of the 20th century, and he gave some new dates, which Fomenko repeats these using Newton calculations, and he discovered that the D graph immediately transformed into that fit within the theory. The jump disappeared, and in his mind, this negated the necessity to invent fictitious, quote, extra gravitational forces. I would agree. Now, I'm only going to co-sign with this stuff that I agree with in this intro. I'm not going to do that. I'm taking a neutral stance, but his approach to this, I'm saying I understand. He feels satisfied. He finishes this work successfully. He solves this puzzle, and then he becomes aware that of this idea that he found rather peculiar, that maybe all of the chronology was not to be trusted, and he was rather horrified by this. So while it's true that the dating's fixed this problem, which is this, strange contradiction in celestial mechanics, what problems does it create in the world of history? So if it worked mathematically, the question is, which is wrong, chronology or astronomy? He approached a bunch of historians within the Moscow State University, and their reaction was of politely telling him there's no point in what he's doing, all dates can easily be verified, and stick to his own subject, essentially. And so he wasn't satisfied. He thought that chronology is a problem of calculating dates, which is relevant to math. So it was within his field of study, which includes astronomical calculation. It includes calendar problems, and the interpretation of these old writings heavily leans on chronology, which creates some complex feelings within him, right? So as he starts to discover this, he starts to look at these ancient dates. He finds that they're kind of arbitrary. Sometimes they're just a quote. They're sourced or cited, unlike his work, very infrequently. That the version of chronology that we use today isn't the only one, and it wasn't the only one that was presented. The scientists from other countries have expressed this idea many times, that ancient dates needed, updating and revising. He realized the answer is not easy, and it's going to take time. And this is how 1973 sees him beginning work in this. He goes on to claim that him and his colleagues, the research progresses, and finally, 7 years later, the first part of these books were published, and some of the opinions have changed since then. Not the general picture, but obviously clarification is made here and there. And this book, the first one, is based on the first one he wrote on the subject, which is, you ready for this title? This is the title, okay? Just give you an idea of how thorough this man is. This is the title of the first book he wrote on this subject. Methods of statistical analysis of narrative text and their application in chronology, identifying and dating dependent text, the statistical chronology of ancient history, the statistics of ancient reports of astronomical events. That's the title. One book. Published in 1990 by Moscow State University. Title thankfully shortened 6 years later. And this, what I'm about to get into, is a summary of all of that material. So now we officially begin the book. I want to say again, before we begin, I do not agree with everything in this book, okay? I'm just presenting it to you the way it was presented to me, except with a lot less density. My goal is that you will be able to actually have a conversation about this author and these books, a thorough, detailed one, and not having to do the work of having to read it. That is my goal. You can listen to this on the way to work or whatever you do, and eventually get a great idea for what is being expressed here. The author begins with a short preliminary account of the current chronology. He thinks for historical science, the importance of this is of the utmost. The distance between time is important to understand the people of that time. In other words, were you to find the date of that an event occurred, or the date in which a tool was constructed, or the date in which these buildings were made according to history is important. You cannot remove the setting from the story. And chronology is a very important part of the setting. He says that if you to get a date wrong of an event warps the entire interpretation and evaluation. Any student of forgotten history, or perhaps inaccurate history, will understand this intuitively. Well, the current globe chronology that we use has Julian calendar datings given to all the major events of history. And all the new documents that are discovered are dated based on this Roman chronology. And all the other ancient datings are linked and referenced to, indirectly or synchronized with, the Roman dates. So in his mind, this is why Roman history will have to be looked at first to establish any logical conclusion. There's a few works the author goes on to describe in the 16th and 17th century that start with a man named Josephus Scaliger. Many know him as the founder of modern chronology. He's written several books. I believe it was interrupted by his death, perhaps, and was concluded by someone named Dionysian Petavius, who also wrote 3 books with very memorable titles such as De Doctrina Temporum. There was a gentleman named Gerhard Miller who in the 1700s revised Russian history in accordance with this new Scaliger take on things. Now, there are works from the 18th to 19th century. He says they're very valuable. They give an idea of the state of chronology during this era of Scaliger and Petavius. He says that this material is not painted over by later refinements, and all of these early series are actually incomplete. He quotes a contemporary chronologist named Bickerman that there has been no chronological research ever conducted that could be called exhaustive, and none of it conforms to modern standards. So he refers to this henceforth as Scaligerian chronology. He finds that not only is this not the only one that existed at that time, but he's not the only one to ask these questions. He says that the Scaliger work, they present this chronology without reason. It's declared to have based on biblical tradition. And he says that history has remained, predominantly based on the Bible or ecclesial for centuries, and it's always been written by the clergy. It is believed that the foundations were laid by Eusebius, Pamphilus, and Saint Hieronymus in the 4th century. This is the modern belief. He sheds a little shade on that by saying here he's got this medieval painting of what's allegedly Eusebius Pamphilus, which is dated 1455. However, he notes that the subject of the painting is wearing medieval clothing, and he speculates that perhaps this is because he lived in that medieval period and was not, in fact, from the ancient past. And he says that one should notice that the gap between the life of Eusebius, the 4th century, and the time of this portrait is 1,000-year different. If we shift Eusebius of Caesarea to live in the 15th century, not the phantom 4th century. Despite the fact that Scaligerian, our modern history, puts this gentleman Eusebius in the 4th century, in the year 260, Eusebius's work, titled The History of Time, from Genesis to the Nicene Council, as well as the accompanying piece by Saint Hieronymus, also known as Saint Jerome, they weren't even discovered until the Middle Ages. So the idea that this man wrote this and then it laid in hiding for 1,000 years until it was rediscovered, he finds questionable. He also says that this original work is only available in fragments, and one has to fill in the gaps that was made by Saint Hieronymus or Saint Jerome. He says that a man named Callistus tried to rewrite the history of the first 3 centuries in the 14th century, or at least fix the history of Eusebius, but in his words, he couldn't do more than just repeat what was already written. And so since this Eusebius work was only published in 1544, which is actually later than the writing of Callistus, he wonders if this Eusebius maybe just based his work on what Callistus wrote, a copy of a copy. He has a painting he presents here of Saint Jerome, or Saint Hieronymus, and his pet lion, which is visiting Eusebius's library. So, to repeat that, Eusebius is the man whose chronicle was retranslated and filled in by this Saint Jerome. And this is the painting of this meeting. But what he points out is this is a medieval scene. The books are a giveaway. They look the same as the ones in the 18th, 19th century. They have straps and hard covers, which were not typical from the 200s. He says the artists of this century probably painted current events and just cast these characters into the Dark Ages by chronologists of today. He says that it is always assumed that this chronology is based on numeric data from the Bible. Certain basis dates used as a reference. For instance, chronologist Asarius says the world was created on Sunday, October 23, 4004 BC in the small hours of the boring. And the author kind of jokes about the mind-boggling accuracy, sarcastic. He says that the secular chronology of science of today is based on biblical chronology of the Middle Ages, which he finds odd. He says that Christian historians have made modern secular chronology match the biblical, and this compilation by St. Jerome is the foundation of all chronological knowledge. He quotes this gentleman Bickerman saying that although Scaliger, who we consider the father of all this, had tried to reconstruct the whole thing, the whole Eusebius writings, which apparently were from 1,000 years earlier, that the datings of Eusebius. So based on the controversy of this and what he finds as dubious about these medieval computations, he wants to give an example of how ridiculous the variation from document to document that they were dealing with at the time. So the Genesis date, the day that the world began, is the one he picks. He says you got this Antiochian dating, according to Theophilus, says it's 5969. The Byzantine dating, or the Constantinople version, is the world was created 5508. 150-year difference. The Alexandrian date has the world beginning at 5493. The Hebrewic date has the world beginning in 4004. The 70 interpreters that got together to really solve this issue puts the date together at 5872. Sumerian 4700. Judaic 3761. Hieronymus says 3491. Eusebius says these two guys worked together, and he says 5199, which is a 2,000-year difference. Augustine has it as 5551, so as you can see, he says this reference point, which would be fundamental, where you're starting from, fluctuates within the span of 2,100 years. And he only quoted the most famous and well-known examples. What they've discovered is there were about 200 various versions of the Genesis date in existence. And the 70 Bible translators that you see pictured here, this was the original dating that they refer to today. These 70 interpreters that got together to figure it out, and allegedly this dates from 1581. And so they are the ones responsible for the 5872 dating. So this correct dating does not conform to any academic standards. And so people in the 17th and 18th century were looking at it harder because there's a lot of dates of events in years past since this. The discrepancies between the starting point substantially affect the datings of many things that we believe, many stories and many documents. Scaliger with Petavius used the astronomical method for proving, but not really examining the medieval version of this stuff. This is why Scaliger's version is considered to be scientific. But this scientific cover, he finds odd that the chronologists of the 17th, 18th century put unwavering faith and loyalty in this chronology that it basically inherited. The author finds it important that this chronology was created within paradigm of the Western European Catholic Church, which these writings come from this control that this group had. And in fact, Archbishop Hieronymus is his title. He comes to the conclusion after he becomes an archbishop that the world was created 3,941 years before the beginning of modern chronology. His colleague, Theophilus, the bishop of Antiochia, you see, had extended this to 55,515. St. Augustine adds another 36 years, while the Irish Archbishop, James Ussher, is the one that made that ridiculous precise. So his point in all this is saying that these chronologists were clergymen. Scaliger was a theologian. The founding father of paleography, Tischendorf, was a doctor of divinity. Petavius was a Jesuit and wrote theological works. And so their trust in the infallibility of the biblical chronology determined everything. Their attitude to any new information was determined by whether or not it could co-sign along with this biblical or religious assumption that was later just called, according to the author, just labeled scientific. So the very fact that these clerical chronologists deified essentially their predecessors, saying this is an act of God, by the hand of God these dates are given to us. Basically, it eliminated the possibility of criticizing the foundations at all. Scaliger wouldn't even consider the idea of running the materials of the Holy Fathers, like Eusebius, through his own fine-toothed comb of critical analysis. He calls the work by Eusebius divine. And they reacted to criticism very bitterly. The author kind of goes on to mock Scaliger, saying by applying what Scaliger's work is in that field to his own, mocking him for turning into a quadraturist, which is someone who tried to build a square, basically tried to square the circle, using nothing but a pair of compasses and a ruler. He believes that this mathematical problem is insoluble as a principle, proven by geometry, but Mr. Scaliger published a book where he claims to have proved the true quadrature which solved the problem problem. He brings this up kind of mockingly, saying that the best mathematicians of the era tried their hardest to prove to him that his reasoning was incorrect, but he refused to see it. So if he's going to turn a blind eye to where he's an area where he's completely outclassed, at what point are we clinging to his proof of chronology? He's basically discrediting him in a way, or at least poisoning the well a little bit. Nevertheless, he says the supporters defend their opinions. They don't want to acknowledge anything. They are scornful. They react with vitriol and ad hominem attacks, calling geometricians ignoramuses. And this is in the field of math that they were calling everyone ignoramuses in their own field. So you can imagine the author speculates how these people reacted towards attempts of analyzing their chronology, which is the field of study that they were allegedly the fathers of. Fomenko points out the history that Scaliger and Petavius brought, they bring it to perfection, in their words, so that these dates are precise. They quote the year, the day, the month, sometimes even the time of day for all the events in the history of humankind. Modern textbooks don't go that deep, they just kind of quote the years. But the audacity of them, according to the author, of going to such ridiculous precision, he finds is numbed a little bit when, these historians, modern day or contemporary writers omit the month, day, and hour, which is actually a step backwards. If we're so certain of this chronology's accuracy, why would we not be so specific? He says by the 19th century, the volume of chronological and historical material grew to such an extent, a printed volume, that the scale was so huge that chronologists of the 19th century didn't even try to go against such a wave, and they would just kind of settle with making minor corrections. And in the 20th century, it's hardly contested at all, according to the author. He says the ancient chronology solidifies in the very shape and form, given to it by Alexandria, Batavia, Scaliger, Theophilus, Eusebius. Someone today, the idea that historians have followed this chronology for 300 years seems ridiculous because it goes against all the tradition. So as chronology develops, the author goes on to explain that people really looking at it had difficulty trying to correlate all the data offered by the sources with the Scalgerian version. It was discovered, he gives the example that Hieronymus misdates his own time by 100 years in one document that he wrote. He gives some examples about where these documents fail even when held up next to themselves, or this chronology that's so agreed upon struggles to actually cover these gaps. Tradition, which separates Alexander the Great from this period by 226 years, was modern day, they extend it to 557 years. So that's a 300-year gap. Got a big year to get someone like Alexander the Great wrong. He says that the Persian period, according to Jewish history, is only 52 years, yet Cyrus II is separated within this very same history from Alexander the Great by 206 years. He says that the Egyptian chronology has been filtered through Christian chronologists. The list of kings were just quotations from Christian authors. The Oriental Church avoided using the birth of Christ as a point of reference because in Constantinople, the debates, it was undecided well into the 19th century. So who criticized this stuff in the past? He's quick to point out, however, lest he take the whole mantle of blame upon himself. He's quick. The next chapter deals with who else criticized this. The aforementioned N.A. Morozov proves that the entire history of this age was medieval. There's a Jesuit historian and archaeologist named John Hardwin who agrees with this and says classic literature was written in monasteries during the 16th century, not the 5th. There's a German named Robert Baldauf who wrote in 1902 that ancient history and early Middle Ages is all a forgery of the Renaissance era. N.A. Morozov, I should have mentioned, wrote the foreword to this book. So he is apparently in relatively complete alignment with, if not the conclusions, but the veracity to the question. He then goes on to describe the eminent English scientist Edwin Johnson, who wrote critical studies of medieval history and severely criticized Scalgerian conclusions. He believed that we're a lot closer to the Greeks and Romans than what they tell us, and called for a revision of the entire thing. And this work was published in early 1900s. He says that Sir Isaac Newton, the mathematician, mechanician, astronomer, and physicist, the creator of classical mechanics, the Royal Society of London, yada yada, developed calculus, all these things. Building his resume here as a selling point, he authored a number of works on chronology where he finds the Scaliger version completely inaccurate. The author explains that this is kind of obscure research because even though it caused major controversy in the past, and he wrote two books, Newton did. He revised one of them. He made a radical revision based on science ideas. He added extra age to a few, but the majority of them he bumped much closer to us. The ones that he added of age were the Voyage of the Argonauts, which he believed happened in the 14th century, but he admits that this is kind of a vague date anyway. He moved most of the events of Alexander the Great closer to us and things like this. In a Morozov, he claims did a much more radical restructuring of events. He thinks that it only began to be accurate starting in the 4th century AD. Contemporary historians, they believe that, Newton was wrong. And the reasons for this are because without being able to properly decipher hieroglyphics, without any archaeological data, because it doesn't exist, his errors were thousands of years off, and his chronology is far from true. And all that Isaac Newton had actually looked at, he hadn't even gotten that far. He basically just looked at the BC chronology of ancient Egypt and Greece. And his works only got published the last year of his life. So, for example, the author goes on to tell you that the first year of reign of the Egyptian pharaoh Menes was 3000 BC, and Newton suggested that this was probably more like 940 BC. 2,000-year difference. It can be kind of a big deal. He claims that the myth of Theseus is dated to 15th century, 15 BC, but he believes that they were 700 years closer to us. The Trojan War, he puts 330 years, interesting number, closer to us. He moves a part of ancient Greece 300 years forward, ancient Egypt 3,000 years forward. So he compresses everything, and much of the ancient Egyptian history he moves it 2,000 years closer. But he never made it any past 200 BC as far as his work. He wasn't and one of the issues that the author goes on to describe here is that he knew that this was complicated, and it was unfinished. He didn't mean to publish this, and he actually rewrote it up to his death a year later. The rumors of his research, right, word had got out, and the Princess of Wales wanted to read it. She was curious, and Isaac Newton gave her the manuscript, but he told her no one should ever hear of it. He also did this to Abbot Conti, who did not listen to Newton's expressed wishes and lent it out to some scientists when he went to Paris. So as a result, a gentleman named Frère translated this into French, adds his own overview to it, which eventually reached a Parisian bookseller, and he writes Newton a letter and says, please, can I publish this? Doesn't get a letter. He waits a year, writes another one saying that, well, if you're not going to respond, essentially that's a yes. Also didn't get a response to that. This man, Gavelier, who had made these threats, basically asked a friend of a friend of a friend of a friend in London to find out personally, which the gentleman made the attempt. Sir Isaac Newton said no. But it was too late. The book had already been published. Isaac Newton received a copy of his own book 7 months later, and he accused the Abbey of breach of promise and publication without the author's consent. And so when he starts receiving criticism, he had to announce it. No, I'm going to prepare a better detailed work on this for publication, which he didn't have time to do because he died, and he left all this research unfinished. And so it's of the author's opinion that this complicated history of this Newton moving things forward and back is incomplete research. The press roasted Newton over this, the historians of the day. Very few articles supported it, and the book was kind of hushed up and, taken out of circulation. They basically flippantly dismissed it. These keepers, these protectors of the chronology. And Morozov was another scientist bold enough to try to do this. Also scorned, even though this man literally authored encyclopedias. But the book then goes into detail about Mr. Morozov. His father was a landowner. His great-grandfather was related to Peter the Great. His mother was a peasant. The church didn't confirm the marriage, and so the children received the mother's name. So at the age of 20, Mr. Morozov joins the libertarian movement, and he was sentenced, because of this, prison for life. He studies chemistry, physics, and astronomy, and math, and history, and he learns all of it by himself. After 25 years of just his crime as joining in the libertarian movement, he was released from jail. Then he immediately jumps into scientific work. He becomes director of the Institute for Natural Scientific Studies. A lot of famous research in chronology using scientific methods supported by the Institute. And after he leaves, the Institute reformed completely, and they threw away all his research. They threw it away into oblivion. He was made member of the Russian Academy of Sciences in 1925. He was given the Order of Lenin, the Red Banner of Labor. So from prison to a self-made And this USSR Academy of Sciences has only 3 members as of 1945, and Morozov is one. He publishes a book called Revelations and Storm, where he analyzes the New Testament apocalypse and comes to the conclusion that contradicts Scaligian chronology. He published several books about Christ, which is called The History of Human Culture from the Natural Scientific Point of View. Very interesting. Criticizes the chronology. Says that what they base it off is basically unverified concept, an idea, no backing. He didn't even know, wasn't even aware, Morozov, of the similar works of Isaac Newton and Edwin Johnson, but he comes to many of the same conclusions, which the author thinks is not a coincidence. And so Morozov went farther than anyone, and he had to, his ideas actually met opposition. Lenin himself was addressed and asked for support. Lenin delegated the study of this issue to someone named Lunacharsky, and his reply to Lenin, his report back was, no, it's preposterous. It uses a ridiculous demonstration to prove the date of the eclipses in the Bible as having accompanied the crucifixion. Christ lived in the 5th century, not the 1st, and uses this data to deny people like Julius Caesar. And the guy says that he's respected and liked Morozov a lot, but the book is bizarre. Its publication should not happen. Because at the time, their Soviet Union communist regime was approved all publications. So this Lunacharsky gentleman happened to meet Morozov later on in time and radically changed his mind about the book and sent it saying, you got to put this out. It's absolutely stunning. Get it published without delay. And the contrast between the 2 letters, the author points out, then they were only 4 months apart, is actually left out of later works. So it still took 3 years from this stage for it to get published. The first volume of it, of 7. And in 1932, after the 7th was published, 8 years later, Morozov's opponents finally stopped him from publishing anything any further. The author goes on to describe how German scientists have published interesting results of their critical analysis of this current chronology. They're gentlemen who challenged the chronology of ancient Egypt in a book called When Did the Pharaohs Live, written in 1924. So he pivots then to the situation with Roman chronology, which has shaped global chronology. And he says that there have been criticisms of this as far back as the 18th century in the Academy of Scriptures and Fine Arts in Paris. There were extensive discussions about the entire Roman timeline. They use examples such as the fact that Tarquin II had already been an adult by the time his father died, and yet his reign had started 39 years after that, yet he was inaugurated as a young lad. So, you're an adult, your dad dies, 39 years after that, you're still young. Something wrong. Pythagoras arrives in Italy an entire generation before the exile of kings, which is supposed to have happened around 509 BC, yet was a friend of Numa Pompilus, who allegedly died 673 BC, so that's a 100-year discrepancy. The state ambassadors who went to the city of Syracuse in the year 262 conversed with Dionysius the Senior, whose reign didn't start till 86 years after that. So there's a deviation of about 80 years. The Scaligian chronology of Rome has no foundation. It's very flimsy. The interval between different datings of the foundations of Rome, which is, pretty important when Rome was founded, is a 500-year discrepancy between Scaligerian's own chronology. The official version has a 500-year discrepancy. According to Damascus and Hellanicus, who supposedly lived in the 4th century, was a point pushed by Aristotle. Rome was founded by Aeneas and Ulysses and named after the Trojan woman Roma. And there are other authors that agree with this. There's a little miniature art named Trojan's Founding Cities, Venice, Carthage, Rome being 3 of them. And he shows this miniature and he says that this is a medieval scene. Clearly, the 2 Trojan kings are wearing warm hats with ear flaps, which is a much more modern, headgear than you would expect to be found in this early time. The Trojan War and the foundation of the Italian Rome were about the same time, according to this work of art, although Scaligerian timeline separates this by 500 years. The foundation of Rome happens right after the Trojan War, in which Aeneas and Ulysses take part in. However, the current official chronology, the Trojan War took place in the 8th century, and the foundation of Rome, which is said to have occurred in the 8th century BC, but the Trojan War allegedly took place in the 13th century BC. So again, 500-year difference. So either the foundation of Rome was 500 years later, closer to us than is thought, or the Trojan War occurred 500 years later, or the chronographers are deliberately lying about Ulysses founding Rome. And the author brings up the point of what happened to Romulus, if that's the case. Is Romulus another name of Ulysses? And the author says that you can see these questions arise, many of them, and once you start diving in, there's a number of them. They keep increasing. According to a different version, the city was named by Romus, the son of Ulysses. So is Remus, the brother of Romulus? Was this the son of Ulysses? It would be impossible within the current chronology. Quotes historians saying Rome was founded by the heroes of Greece and Troy that wound up in those parts, and the legends prove it. And this is actually repeated by Aristotle, that the city was founded by Ulysses and received its name from the Trojan woman Roma. And Romus, the son of Ulysses and Circe, was its founder, which again, there's 500 years separating these dates. So these fluctuations, and something as important as the foundation of the city of Rome, affect many documents, as you can imagine, that use this as a reference point. History by Titus Livy is one of them. And the identification of the city, Rome, with the Italian Rome is the hypothesis only of modern chronology. It's very possible that Rome, the city, can actually be identified as what's known as Rome upon the Bosporus, or Constantinople, which was known as Tsargrad, or the City of the Kings. So historians, traditional Roman history, we get it from just a few authors. The most fundamental one being, the one by Titus Livy, believe that he was born 59 BC. He describes a 700-year period of history, and there's 144 books he wrote, and 35 have survived. 35 out of 144. And the first publication of these writings took place in 1469. Got that? Born in 59 BC, didn't find these books until 1469, and only found 35 out of the 144. And the first was published in 1469, and based on a manuscript of unknown origin that was then lost. And then later on, 5 years after that, they found a manuscript with 5 more works. And so he quotes a historian named Thomson, who writes, "The development of historical science, any hope for getting it right, is buried in frustration. The more research was conducted and the deeper it went, the more obvious difficulties became." He says that the numeric inaccuracies are systematic until the contemporary historical period. He gives an example of the missing 500 years. He says that this era was filled in with a ghostly list of rulers like the ones used in Egypt and Greece, just kings with no Adventinus and Tiberinus and all these people into existence. They invented first names, periods of rule, painted portraits. Other than that, there's no information. This ultra-skepticism is really all based on the first 5 centuries of Roman history don't match the Scaliger chronology. And the real problem, according to another historian, because all of these are quotes and cites, none of these are his, he's not just saying these things. Each one of these cited. He's saying that, according to this other historian, that Roman manuscripts, the real problem is that they haven't survived. All the presumptions are based on whatever the Roman annalists later, but they run into difficulties. The principal one being that the material they present is presented very poorly. All the great annals of Rome are gone. The Roman authorities used to give yearly chronological lists of all the civil servants of Rome, which would theoretically be a good use. But as another historian, Martinov, points out, how can we make all of this concur with the constant controversy we encounter in almost every text of Livy, and the names of the consuls and their missions, and the complete laissez-faire attitude to the choice of names? There's so many errors and distortions that even Livy himself had admitted that this foundation of his chronology was flimsy. He says the Fasti, it doesn't tell us anything about who was made consul, and the most trustworthy documentation is the kind that becomes identified as much more recent forgeries every time they look at it very long. Mr. Bickerman says that we possess full lists of Roman consuls for 1,000 years, and so the Julian dating can be deduced easily, given that the datings are accurate, which implication is that we have a trustworthy Julian dating of the foundation of Rome, despite the fact that the 500-year fluctuations of this date would, literally affect everything on the consul list, as well as the whole history of ancient Rome. The author goes on to describe Bickerman's monograph doesn't even try to provide a new history. He just points out all the flaws because there is no fundamental ground, no historical, official, original documentation left with which to reconstruct it. So all this is to say, if there's a withering attack to be made at anyone questioning history, well, that's to be shared by a wide and rather accomplished mantle. Then turns his attention to the Egyptian chronology and the difficulties within. So he starts with the history by Herodotus and compares it to the modern chronology, Scaligean chronology. Herodotus calls Cheops the successor of Rhampsinitos. I don't know who these people are personally, and I don't know if I'm saying their names right. The modern commentator will actually correct this by saying, well, actually, Herodotus creates confusion in the chronology because Rhampsinitos was a king of the 19th century, whereas Cheops belonged to the 4th century. So that's a 1,200-year discrepancy of people who are supposed to be family members. 1,200 years. According to Herodotus, someone named Asychus was succeeded by Anisus. Modern commentary tells us Herodotus leaps from the end of the 4th dynasty, about 2,400 years, to the beginning of the Ethiopian reign in Egypt, in 1750. So that is an 1800-year gap. The chronology of kings that Herodotus gives does not match the one that found in the fragments of Manetho's list of kings. So the chronology of Herodotus is much shorter than the Scalgerian version. The time intervals are often thousands of years shorter than corresponding periods. The history of Herodotus contains minor errors of, 30, 40 years, but they only come to existence to try to fit this history into the modern one. There's examples given with characters I don't know, such as saying Pittacus, who could not have met Croesus in 560 BC, since he died in 570 BC. Solon could not have met Croesus, but how can this be true? The author speculates because Herodotus devotes an entire page to relating the interactions between these two. So Scaliger tells you that it couldn't have happened because these dates were so far apart. They accuse Herodotus of dating solar eclipses incorrectly. Fomenko then goes on to say that to choose one version from several conflicting ones is not easy. It'd be different if there was just two, but there was a conflict between the short and long, and they use the short one currently, but it still contains a great many deep contradictions which remain unresolved. He cites this German Egyptologist who has expressed concern that when one consults the charts to find what era or year certain pharaohs live, he immediately comes into a bewildering array of dates. The first Egyptian pharaoh was, by various German scientists, dates 5702, 5613, 4455, 4157, 3892, 3620. I mean, it's a 2,000-year difference. And this is within German Egyptologists themselves. So they conduct, and this is the most competent research done by scientists, specialists in this area. So what he's saying is this is why they had to have simultaneous parallel reigns that would reduce the summary reigning time of the official dynasties. So despite all the scientific discoveries made, the data still to this day is unclear and unsatisfactory. And the author points out that this is still true today. Modern tables will say things like the beginnings of the reign of Menes to approximately 3100 BC or roughly 3000 BC. And these fluctuations amount up to 30,000 years. And this is within German Egyptologists alone. Now you open the door to French Egyptologists and you find even more. You find dates that range from 5867 to 2224. As far as when the first pharaoh took the throne. This is a 3,643-year difference. The authors found out that Egyptology, which is a study of ancient Egypt, only came into existence 80 years ago. And it's been the private study of a very few researchers, and a lot of their results of this has been popularized way too quickly, and so many erroneous views exist, which essentially, when Egyptology became a lot less raved about and printed about, the excessive trust in the results of the research was actually lost. And so, to this day, the author writes that the construction of the Egyptian chronology is actually impossible. The list of the kings compiled by Sumerian priests is even more complex. It was just a little skeleton that sort of resembled the tables, but it makes no sense according to archaeologist El Woolley. The dynastical sequences are randomly set, and so all the antiquity that's given to these lists contradicts all the modern archaeological information. And Fomenko goes on to give just one example that he thinks is telling enough. He says that during the excavations of the most ancient royal Sumerian sepulchres, which they date to the 3rd millennium, Woolley finds golden toiletry that was Arabic and belonged to the 13th century, according to the best expert in the field. Woolley thinks that this expert made a mistake, a forgivable mistake, since no one had thought such advanced art could have existed in the 3rd millennium. Doesn't consider the idea that his own chronology was off. So this entire critical concept of the idea of criticizing history in the late 19th, early 20th century, as all of these examples the author's been pulling from. Remember, this chapter, he's just dealing with other people that have asked the same question. And he says that the freeze, that the stop of this research due to the lack of statistical methods that everyone could agree and get behind, that these methods didn't exist. Ones that could provide for independent verification of things. In other words, how to take all this information, all these conflicting dates, and mathematically apply it in using statistics to arrive at the most accurate possible dating, since being the actual date would be impossible. And then aligning that with the current math regarding the celestial bodies and regarding chronology in general from the math point of view, is there a way to apply mathematics to this problem and construct something that's a framework that we can all build on going forward? The author also invites everyone in the world to join in on this discussion. Doesn't think that he is the end-all be-all, or his team, and he opens the conversation, wants to open the conversation to anyone and everyone. At this point, we turn to another chapter, and this is the problem in dating the ancient sources. The origins of these sources, and modern historians say that there's not much evidence in the dates, the genesis, the creation dates of these ancient manuscripts. The observation is that the overwhelming majority of these documents appeared during the Renaissance era. That was before the Dark Ages. The discovery of manuscripts happened under circumstances that don't allow any analysis to, criticize or analyze the date of these findings. So the example the author gives is in the 19th century. 19th century, two historians published this results of this research to prove that Roman history by Cornelius Tacitus was actually written by an Italian humanist named Poggio Bracciolini, and they're saying that these publications were 1882 and 1878. There's an entire book written about this, which he sources, but he says that that they believe, the author and his team believe, that the history by Tacitus is an edited original. It's a partial forgery, and the events within have been misdated and transposed far back in time. Because of the history of the discovery of Tacitus's books it was Poggio who discovered and published all of these opuses of Quintilian and Valerius Flaccus and Asconius Pedianus, all these names I don't know, Marcellinus and Probus and Cicero and Lucretius. The circumstances of how these discoverings were made and how their dates were determined were never really told in any detail. In the 15th century, some famous humanists, as they were called, come to Italy, and they familiarize Europe with the advancements in ancient Greek philosophy. Byzantium gives the West all of the quote-unquote ancient Greek manuscripts. So the major part of the knowledge from Greek science is based on Roman or Byzantine copies made 1,500 years, sometimes 500 to 1,500 years after the death of their authors. So 500 to 1,500 years after these people die, the documents are related from it, that's what they're trusting. The entire bulk of the ancient literature only arrived, according to Scaliger history, during the Renaissance. Many cases, like detailed analysis, shows that the obscurity, I guess, of these writings, discoveries, and all the lack of reasoning or information regarding how it survived the Dark Ages makes one suspect that none of these texts really existed before the Renaissance. The example given is that the oldest copies of the incomplete collection of Cicero's texts were allegedly made in the 9th, 10th century. However, one finds out that the original of this collection had perished a long time ago. In the 14th, 15th century, there's a surge of interest in Cicero. So 1420, you have this professor, Gasparino Barzizai, decides to undertake the endeavor of filling the gaps in this incomplete collection with his own writings, just to make it flow. But before he could finish this, a miracle happened. A lonely document with the complete text of all the works of Cicero. They find it in an Italian town. This man's students eagerly embrace this discovery, and they decipher it, and they finally produce a copy. During this time, the original of the collection becomes abandoned, since no one wants to look at the textual difficulties it presents, and it gets sent back to the town it was found, where it vanishes without a trace, and nothing is known of what happened to it since 1428. The author also points out that the name Barzizza is close to the consonant root of the name Cicero, implying the Barzizzo character was invented. He does go on to show two ancient miniatures from a book by Cicero that was published allegedly in the 15th century, and these also were in a medieval setting, wearing medieval clothes, meaning that the author in the 15th century didn't doubt Cicero was a contemporary. I mean, it would be the editor's note. This is the implication is that this is like you setting out to paint a picture of Abraham Lincoln in a baseball hat and talking on an iPhone. There's also a historian named Caius Suetonius, who was reportedly composed of an ancient manuscript that was presumed to be in possession in the year 818. The original document did not reach our time, and neither did the first copies. So the oldest of his Suetonius copies is the 9th century text that was brought to light in the 16th century. And fragments from it appeared very late. The alleged dating of the last fragment is the 9th century, discovered by, of course, Poggio in Germany in 1425. The manuscript did not survive, but 20 copies did that were made in Italy 100 years later. So the dating of these ancient sources were performed in the 16th to 17th century in methods that are would be completely unheard of today. Vitruvius's book, which was discovered in 1497, quotes the heliocentric planetary circulations with precision, and they claim Vitruvius, this architect who lived in the 1st century, how could he know these periods better than Copernicus? There are also parallels between the books of ancient Vitruvius and Alberti, which Alberti was a prominent architect, the author of the theory that is very similar to the theory of the ancient Vitruvius. And Mr. Alberti also wrote a voluminous book including math, optical, mechanical knowledge, as well as this theory of architecture. Alberti's books have an ancient analog by Vitruvius. Now, is this ancient Vitruvius just an ideal and a fake creation of his own? He says that the volume is written in an archaic manner. Specialists compare fragments of both of these works, which sometimes coincide word for word. All these numerous parallels show the Hellenistic Roman atmosphere that his thoughts evolved in is the explanation. So the book of the ancient Vitruvius fits into medieval atmosphere and ideology of the 15th century perfectly. And the Alberti's medieval constructions are just an emulation of the ancient style. He makes a palace that is made to resemble Roman amphitheater. So the author points out the ludicrous idea that the leading medieval architect fills Italian towns with ancient edifices that are nowadays considered an emulation of the classical age, but by no means does this imply they were considered that way in the 15th century. And the books are also written in a manner that will be made archaic much later. And it's only until after all this when the book of the ancient architect Vitruvius appears, coincidentally coinciding with the similar book of Alberti, which is word for word. So the idea that the author is putting forth here is that the architects of the 14th, 15th century didn't consider their endeavors to be an emulation of the classical age. They were the classical age. The emulation theory evolved much later in the works of Scaliger or modern historians, and who then had to explain why the classical age and the Middle Age has so many parallels. Now, I'm going to take an uncharacteristic interjection here and note what a similar situation that we are often shown today. Why do our buildings, for example, our architecture, look so classical? And we're told it's an emulation of the classical age. The idea I would propose would be perhaps they were from this very same classical age. Interesting that Fomenko is coming to this conclusion regarding another part of the world, from another method of looking at this entirely. Okay. Editor's note ended. And one observes, then he goes on to point out a similar situation with science and how European scientists take things like Archimedes, Apollonius, Euclid. The Middle Ages were the time when the revival, you get that? The revival of the achievements of ancient science took place. Yet, not a single copy of Euclid's Elements has survived today. The oldest manuscript we know of is a copy made in the year 1000. There's a number of manuscripts, not just one, there's one copy of one manuscript made in 888, that year, 888. There are a large number of manuscripts that date from Euclid from the 13th century. There's a page from this deluxe edition of Euclid's Geometry, dated 1457, which contains panoramic view of Rome. Interesting that this ancient Euclid book contains a alleged picture of medieval Rome and not ancient Rome. There's a Christian Gothic cathedral in the foreground, which clearly had to have come much later, giving the idea that Euclid is actually a medieval author. Here's that picture, and this is allegedly from a book written in the BC era. There is, in the world of mathematics, before the Latin translation of Arithmetica by the ancient Diophantus, the European scientists have been using, there's an assuring that the European scientists have been using these algebraic methods without even knowing about his works, which math historian Bashmakova says this is somewhat paradoxical, because the first edition of this book is dated to 1575 AD. If Ptolemy's book Almagest was instantaneously continued by Copernicus, which is what the story that we're told, then Diophantus' book must have been continued by Fermat. The history of both the manuscripts and the printed editions of the ancient Archimedes follows this pattern, which is all of the modern editions are based on the lost manuscript of the 15th century and the Constantinople book that was found in 1907. So the first manuscripts, it's assumed, of Archimedes reached Europe in 1204. The first translation was made in 1269, 60 years later, and yet the complete text finally found in 1884, 700 years later. The first printed edition was in 1503 and the first Greek edition in 1544. He includes a portrait of allegedly ancient Archimedes from his book that was dated in the 15th century, which is a typical medieval scientist in his study, which the commentators or the editors wrote that the study is represented in the Renaissance fashion. And how would ancient Archimedes know what a Renaissance fashion would be? The book Conical Sections by Apollonius wasn't published until 1537. Kepler, the discoverer of ellipses in astronomy, never lived to see the works of Apollonius published. The next 3 books were published in Latin translation, which is another translation of a translation. So the body of the work of ancient Apollonius only gets to be published in its entirety after the discovery of the objects that this ancient book deals with. So could the works of, you see what he's saying here? So couldn't Apollonius just be an edited version of Polonius, which just simply means a native of Poland or Polonia, which is what Copernicus was, seeing as how Copernicus was the immediate precursor of the astronomer Kepler? Is this just a tongue-in-cheek way of saying the Pole Copernicus, meaning the native of Poland? Interesting questions raised here. I'll pick it up next time, Chapter 6. I'll see you soon.